They say not every story begins with a crime. Sometimes it begins with a suspicion. And sometimes suspicion itself is the crime. On a gray morning in Havenfield, Officer Mark Holden sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, tapping the steering wheel with restless fingers. To him, the town was quiet only because people were hiding something. A town with shuttered shops, cracked sidewalks, and a fading slogan on the welcome sign that read, "Where trust and law walk together." Mark didn't believe it. For him, trust was weakness and the law was whatever his instincts decided. That's when he saw it. An old Buick, gliding down the street with the calm of someone who didn't need to prove anything. No sudden swerves. No speeding. No reason at all to be noticed. Except to Mark, the reason was obvious. A black man, well into his 70s, was sitting behind the wheel of a car that didn't seem to match what he thought a man like that should own. Mark narrowed his eyes. Too clean, too careful, too deliberate. He told himself it wasn't profiling, it was instinct. But in truth, instinct was just the name he gave to bias. The Buick slowed for a turn, steady, quiet, drawing no attention. But that calm unsettled Mark more than a reckless driver ever could. He switched on his red and blue lights. The car pulled over instantly. No hesitation, no fuss. Too calm. Mark stepped out of his cruiser, hand grazing the holster at his hip, not from fear but from habit. His boots struck the asphalt harder than they needed to, as if noise could make up for doubt. The window of the Buick lowered smoothly, and the driver looked at him. An elderly man in a gray hat, pressed shirt, and dark gloves. His posture upright, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't blink nervously. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply looked at Mark as though Mark were the one under inspection. "Morning," Mark said flatly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The old man tilted his head. His voice was even, low, without anger or fear. "I imagine you have your reasons, but I won't presume to guess," Mark frowned. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't submission. It was something worse, calmness that stripped away his authority. "Where are you headed?" Mark pressed, raising his voice. The old man answered simply, "To a farewell." "A farewell?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "Who passed?" The man's gaze lingered on the horizon. "A piece of history." The words landed heavy. Too poetic, too strange, too confident. And yet they gave Mark nothing. No offense, no excuse, no foothold. He turned sharply back to his car, punched the license plate into the system. Nothing. Clean. No flags. No violations. He glanced at the man again, still seated upright, eyes forward, hands steady. Not a twitch of unease. Mark walked back, irritation simmering. "I'm going to need your ID." The man reached into his vest pocket and handed over a small, weathered wallet. Inside was a government card with a silver seal so faint it looked like it had been rubbed by time. Mark squinted at it. "Never seen one like this," he smirked. "Nice forgery." Half joke, half test, the man didn't flinch. He nodded once. "If you believe it's false, call it in." Mark's jaw tightened. That wasn't the reaction he wanted. No panic, no excuses, no trembling hands. Just quiet confidence. It made him feel like he was the one being judged. "Where are you from?" Mark asked. The man finally turned, his gaze steady and direct. "I live here. I've lived here since before you were born." There was no insult in it, but the weight of those words pressed against Mark's chest. It made him pause. For the first time in a long while, he felt control slipping. He steadied himself, his tone sharper. "I'm going to need you to pop the trunk." The man's response was calm but deliberate. "For what reason?" "I suspect something unusual." The man raised an eyebrow. "Would you mind putting that suspicion in writing?" Mark faltered. "I haven't written a report yet." "So you're checking me," the man said softly, "based on a feeling." Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavier. Mark's authority felt thinner. He exhaled sharply, trying to mask the unease rising inside him. He wasn't facing defiance. He wasn't facing fear. He was facing something worse, a presence that refused to bend. And for the first time that morning, Mark realized this wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a confrontation with something he didn't yet understand. Mark returned to his cruiser, his pulse quickening though he would never admit it. He called dispatch, muttering the name printed on the ID. Samuel E. Carter. The line went quiet for 3 long seconds. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough for silence to feel like judgment. Finally, the operator's voice came back, but it wasn't the usual casual tone. It was slower, colder. "Repeat that name." Mark tapped the console impatiently. "Carter, Samuel E. Carter, elderly male. Driving a Buick. I'm requesting verification." There was no immediate reply, only the sound of typing, keys pressed with deliberate care. Then a pause that stretched far too long. "Hold." Mark stiffened. He wasn't used to being put on hold. Not for a routine stop. Not for someone like this. His foot tapped against the floorboard, his chest tight with something he didn't want to name. He ended the call before they could return. He couldn't sit there waiting to be told what he already thought he knew, that the ID was fake, that his suspicion was justified. He needed to reassert control. Slamming the door, he marched back to the Buick. The old man hadn't moved. His hands still rested on the wheel, his gaze steady on the horizon. He looked like a figure carved into stone, unmoved by time or threat. Mark pulled the ID from his pocket, holding it up. His thumb pressed against the edge as if testing whether authority could cut like a blade. "You sure this is legitimate?" he asked, his tone heavy with both doubt and threat. The man's reply was soft, almost weary. "I gave you what I have. Whether you believe it is your choice. No fear, no defensiveness, just patience, as if Mark were a child tugging at a curtain too heavy to move." Mark swallowed hard. Something about the man's voice made his skin prickle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp, but it stripped the power from his badge in a way anger never could. He snapped, "Step out of the vehicle." The old man turned at last, his eyes locking onto Mark's. Not hostile, not submissive, but unwavering. "Under what regulation?" "State enforcement policy." Mark shot back quickly. "I have the right if I have reasonable suspicion." "And what is your suspicion?" The silence that followed was brutal. Mark had nothing. No speeding. No broken light. No erratic behavior. Only a feeling he didn't dare name. His jaw clenched. "Unusual behavior," he forced out. The man tilted his head, calm as ever. "You call it unusual because I don't look at you the way others do? Because I'm not trembling? Because I don't play the part you expect?" Mark's chest tightened. He had faced plenty of drivers, angry, scared, reckless. But never this. Never a man whose very calmness unraveled the structure of his authority. Still he pressed on, voice colder. "Open the trunk." The man sighed, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of someone who had lived through storms greater than this. "I'll open it," he said, stepping out of the car with slow, deliberate movements. His posture was straight, his pace unhurried. "But if you find nothing, tell me." "What will you do then?" Mark faltered. He had no answer, because finding nothing meant confronting the possibility that his entire suspicion was nothing but prejudice, and that was a truth he couldn't afford to face. The old man walked to the back of the Buick, keys in hand. With a click, the trunk opened. Inside lay no weapons, no contraband, no hidden crime. Only a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in plain brown paper, a folded navy blue suit jacket, and a wooden box with a single name engraved into it: Elias Carter. The man's hand brushed the lid of the box gently, almost reverently. Then he turned back toward Mark. "This," he said quietly, "is all I carry." Mark's throat felt dry. None of it was illegal. None of it suspicious. And yet the simplicity itself was devastating. Because it was proof that all his instincts, all his authority, all his certainty had led him nowhere. The man continued, his tone soft but cutting. "I have no weapons. I hide nothing. I carry only memory." For the first time, Mark felt something break inside him. Not defiance, not disrespect, but dignity so absolute it could not be touched. And in that moment he realized the stop was no longer about law. It was about him. About the cracks in his own authority that this man's silence had forced wide open. Mark stood frozen by the open trunk, staring at the lilies in the box. Nothing criminal. Nothing threatening. And yet the scene was heavier than if he'd found weapons. The old man gently closed the trunk, his movements slow, deliberate. Then he looked at Mark. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something worse. A sadness that wasn't about himself, but about Mark. "You're doing your job," the man said evenly, "but that doesn't give you the right to misread who I am." Mark stiffened. Those words slid under his skin like ice. No yelling. No protest. Just truth. He stepped back, trying to shake it off, trying to cling to protocol. His radio crackled and he hurried back to his cruiser, muttering into the mic, "Name Samuel E. Carter." The reply came after a pause. A new voice this time, deeper, sharper. "Are you confirming you have Justice Samuel Elias Carter stopped on the roadside?" Mark froze, his breath caught.
"Justice?"
The voice cut him off. "Do not proceed further. Repeat, do not proceed further. Hold your position." Mark's fingers tightened around the mic. His chest pounded. Justice? No, it couldn't be. This man wasn't just an elderly driver. He wasn't just a citizen. He was one of the architects of the very laws Mark claimed to serve. His mouth went dry. He ended the call before dispatch could say more. His hand shook, and for the first time the silence of the street felt crushing. He turned back toward the Buick. The old man hadn't moved. Still seated, still calm, still upright. The posture of someone who didn't need defense because dignity was its own shield. Mark's boots scraped against the pavement as he approached again. He wanted to say something, anything, but the word stuck, and then it happened. A woman carrying grocery bags stopped on the sidewalk. She stared at the old man, eyes wide, her lips trembling. She didn't speak his name. She didn't need to. Her expression said enough. She stepped backward slowly, almost bowing her head as if in the presence of something sacred. Then her eyes cut toward Mark, sharp with warning. "You don't know who that is?" she whispered, her voice heavy with disbelief. Mark didn't reply. His throat was too tight. She shook her head, her voice rising just enough to carry. "He's the reason my brother ever had a second chance. He saw what no one else saw. And now you stop him?" Mark's chest tightened as though her words had weight he couldn't shrug off. He'd faced anger before. He'd faced shouting. But this disappointment, raw and heavy, was unbearable. A young man pedaled up on a bike, pulled out his phone, and began recording. Not Mark, not the flashing lights. He pointed the lens at Samuel Carter. Mark raised his hand sharply. "Stop filming. This is an active police situation." The young man looked up, calm but clear. "I'm not filming you. I'm filming dignity. Some people go their whole lives without seeing it." Mark's hand dropped. He had no response. His badge suddenly felt heavier than his chest could carry. The old man stepped out of the Buick at last. His voice, low but steady, carried across the silence. "You've done enough." He turned, adjusting his jacket, and with unhurried grace stepped back into his car. The door closed with the softness of finality. He started the engine, the Buick rolling forward smooth and silent, leaving Mark standing in the road as if abandoned by the very authority he thought he controlled. The crowd that had gathered, 2, then 5, then more, watched in silence as the car disappeared. Phones recorded. Eyes lingered. Not one of them looked at Mark with respect. Not one. He stood there, badge on his chest, gun at his side, but stripped of something deeper, legitimacy. And when the Buick turned the corner and vanished from sight, Mark realized the stop was no longer his. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And worse, it now belonged to the world. That night, the silence of Havenfield didn't stay in Havenfield. It was carried on phones through shaky recordings and hurried captions. Within hours, a 40-second clip began circling online. No commentary, no music. Just a silent video of Samuel Carter stepping out of his Buick, placing a bouquet of lilies on the trunk, then turning his steady gaze toward Officer Mark Holden. The caption read, "Stopped, not for law. Stopped for looking wrong." By sunrise, the video had reached 200,000 views. By noon, millions. Comments poured in. This isn't just profiling. This is humiliation. That officer wasn't questioning a man. He was questioning dignity itself. My God, that's Justice Carter. I studied his rulings in law school. The town of Havenfield, forgotten by most, was now trending across the country. Mark sat in his cruiser, scrolling through fragments of news alerts on his phone. Each headline was worse than the last. Supreme Court Justice detained in questionable stop. The judge who rewrote civil rights, pulled over like a suspect. His stomach twisted. He hadn't just pulled over a man. He had pulled over a mirror, one that was now forcing the entire nation to look at itself. At the precinct, whispers spread faster than official memos. Officers leaned close in hallways, muttering, "He stopped the wrong man." No, he stopped the right man at the worst possible time. Mark's commanding officer, Captain Ross, called him into a cramped office. His voice was low but sharp. You don't understand what you've done. That man isn't a name on a license. He's history. He's the backbone of rulings that kept this state from slipping back 50 years. And you stopped him on a feeling. Mark tried to speak, but Ross cut him off. Don't explain. Don't justify. Just understand your badge is not a shield today. It's tinder. Meanwhile, outside the walls of law enforcement, Carter's name surged. Old recordings resurfaced. His speeches on justice, his quiet refusals of power, his long years on the bench. A generation that barely knew his face now saw him in silence, standing calm before flashing red lights. A teacher in Boston replayed the viral clip in her civics class. She didn't lecture. She simply asked her students, "What is justice if even its guardians are doubted?" No one answered. One student finally whispered, "The way he looked at that officer, it was like a man who carried history in his eyes." The clip traveled again, now clipped into lessons, into sermons, into courtrooms where young lawyers saw not a headline, but a question, and questions have longer lives than answers. Back in Havenfield, crowds began leaving small tokens outside the courthouse. Notebooks, flowers, folded slips of paper with handwritten messages. Not for Carter, he hadn't asked for tribute. They were messages for themselves, confessions, reminders, apologies. Mark walked past them on his way to work, each note a silent indictment. At home, things grew worse. His son, barely 13, held a crumpled printout from social media. It showed the same clip everyone had seen. Carter standing tall, lilies trembling in his hand. The boy's voice was quiet but cutting. "Dad, you once told me a good man doesn't make people afraid when he walks into a room. So why did that man look like he had to prove he wasn't dangerous behind you?" Mark tried to answer, but the words tangled and broke before leaving his throat. His son didn't wait. He just turned away, leaving silence thicker than any reprimand. That night, Mark realized punishment didn't come from the department. It came from the look in his son's eyes. But while his world collapsed inward, Carter's silence spread outward. He gave no interviews, no statements, and yet everywhere people acted differently. Teachers asked new questions. Clerks addressed names with more care. Officers across the country paused before writing reports, remembering the video that needed no explanation. Samuel Carter hadn't spoken a word. And still, he was changing the system. The firestorm didn't fade. It spread. News anchors called it the Havenfield stop. Commentators described it as the moment when law itself stared into a mirror. Carter's name, once buried in legal archives, was now spoken in classrooms, on talk shows, even in living rooms where people who had never read a court ruling suddenly felt its weight. And still, Samuel Carter remained silent. No interviews, no rebuttals, no public appearances except walking calmly into the courthouse on Mondays, reviewing petitions with the same quiet patience he had carried for decades. His silence became the loudest voice in the country. Mark Holden, meanwhile, was drowning. Internal review panels dragged up his record. Every stop he had made, every name he had written down, every report that smelled of bias. Things he thought would never surface now shone like stains under a floodlight. An old man he'd once ordered out of a pickup came forward on local news. "I didn't fight him then. I thought I was unlucky. Now I see, I was just another name he misread." A young woman once detained because her car looked too new, stood before a university crowd. "I'm alive, but I spent 30 minutes believing I wasn't going to be." That was my introduction to justice. Each testimony was a cut, not just at Mark, but at the system that had praised him for instincts. At the precinct, officers no longer greeted him with nods. Conversation stopped when he entered. His badge felt less like metal, more like an apology no one wanted to hear. One evening, he returned home to find his son's civics homework left open on the kitchen table. In shaky handwriting, the boy had written, "If following the rules hurts someone, is it still right?" Mark sat there for a long time, staring at the page, realizing his son was asking questions he himself had never dared face. And across town, Carter walked into a legislative hearing, unannounced. No cameras had been prepared. No seat had been reserved. He simply entered quietly, notebook tucked under his arm, and sat in the last row. The chamber stilled. Lawmakers shifted uneasily. They debated reforms, spoke of oversight, but their voices faltered whenever their eyes drifted toward him. He never spoke. He never raised his hand. But his presence forced them to measure every word. At last, one young delegate stood, abandoning his notes. His voice cracked but carried. I don't have numbers. I don't have a plan. I only know my father stayed in law school because of something this man once said. And if we can't act knowing who sits among us, then maybe we don't deserve these seats. The chamber went silent. Cameras caught nothing but shifting faces and the steady scribble of Carter's pencil. Later that evening, headlines spread not about speeches or bills, but about the man who sat quietly in the back row and made the entire room feel judged without saying a word. As for Mark, his collapse was quieter. Pulled from patrol, reassigned to records, he spent his days staring at names on paper. Names he once dismissed, now heavy with the weight of humanity. At night, he replayed the stop in his mind over and over, not the moment he flipped on the lights, not even the moment Carter showed his ID. The moment that haunted him was simpler. The nod. The soft, unshaken nod Carter gave before leaving. A nod that carried no anger, no surrender, but a truth Mark could never unsee. Some men don't need to fight to win. They only need to stand, unbroken, and that was the verdict Mark would carry for the rest of his life. Because in the end, the stop wasn't about Carter at all. It was about a system that confused suspicion with justice, and a single man who reminded the world in silence that dignity doesn't ask for permission.